Hello and welcome to Between the Lines. I'm Julian, an obsessive reader and book collector, and today I'm talking my sci-fi fantasy TBR. So this is going to be just an informal kind of casual breakdown of the series and individual books I want to read in fantasy and sci-fi, which will hopefully give you a sense of what I'm into, what I'm excited to read, and maybe what I'm going to start reading soon and review on the channel. And hopefully in the end maybe get some recommendations from you as well. So let's get into it. So if you're not familiar with who I am and kind of what I do here on the channel, I collect a lot of used books. I mostly do it for sci-fi and fantasy books because they're really easy to find in those kind of stores. So I'm always on the lookout for those kind of books, and I'm going to be showing a lot of what I've already begun to collect today with the series that are on my TBR. Most of those series are going to be pretty incomplete because it's kind of a toss-up when you go to a used bookstore. You're not really gonna find a whole series there. So a lot of what I have is just kind of broken into incomplete parts of a series, or maybe I'll have the first couple. I also use my local library for a lot of these books, so I don't technically own them, even though I have access to them. But for those that I have the copies of, I'm gonna put them up on screen so you can see what I have so far. I know I called this the sci-fi fantasy TBR, but we're just gonna go ahead and start with fantasy. I think that's what most people are here for anyway. So to get started, we're gonna break down some series, and I'll start with the biggest and baddest series that's on my TBR, The Wheel of Time. So this is one that's really big on BookTube right now. It's causing a huge stir because of the show coming out in a couple months. But for me, I've actually wanted to get into this series for a couple years. It started for me when I was getting back into fantasy and kind of exploring what was popular with people, and I discovered The Wheel of Time. So this year I actually started collecting the books. When I go to used bookstores, I would look out for them specifically in order to gear up for my eventual read that I knew was coming up soon. And over the course of months, I've actually collected most of them. The only ones I'm missing are the prequel, New Spring, and the last book in the series, A Memory of Light. This book series, from what I've heard of it, sounds exactly what I'm into with regards to fantasy. I've heard it has a lot of Tolkien influences at the beginning, but slowly becomes its own thing as the series goes along. Something that big just sounds like it kind of has a bit of everything in it, so I'm really excited to explore what that series has to offer over the course of 14 or 15 books if you include the prequel. I'm not sure exactly when to start. I know I need to be in the right headspace to get into a giant series like this. I don't want to force it. I also don't really want to be tied to any other gigantic series that I'm currently reading, which leads me to the series that I sort of want to finish before I start The Wheel of Time, which is the Dresden Files. So the Dresden Files are a series of mystery fantasy novels written by Jim Butcher, and there's a lot of them. I actually just finished book 11 yesterday, so I'm still kind of in the midst of the series, but I'm trying to get that done maybe before Wheel of Time, or maybe if I have just a couple left, then I'll start the Wheel of Time. So if you don't know what the series is about, it follows a private investigator who also happens to be a wizard as he solves crimes that kind of brush up against the paranormal magical community. When the series starts, it's very into the hard-boiled detective genre, but slowly kind of branches away from that as it goes further along and starts establishing its own world building a bit more. Mystery and detective fiction is actually one of my favorite genres, so when I heard of this series for the first time, I got really excited. I found Stormfront, the first book, at a used book sale last September, and in reading them, I think that they're really fun. It's not a perfect series. I find that the blend of mystery and fantasy is good in some books and struggles to mesh well in other books. But overall, I'm not going to complain. These are two of my favorite genres in one, and the books themselves are really fun and entertaining. My favorites so far being book 7, book 9, and I think now book 11. And I know it's not really news to people that the series is inconsistent with quality. There certainly were a couple books, especially earlier on, that didn't really do it for me, specifically book 3 and 6. And having just finished book 11, I am really excited to get into book 12, which is Changes, which I know is really big in the series, and I'm not really sure what I'm about to get into. And in this case with the Dresden Files, I've actually read in multiple formats. So I started off with print, I got a couple for my ebook reader, and I've slowly started getting into the audiobooks, which are actually really good and are the first big audiobooks I've started listening to. But I'm not going to buy any more of these as my local library has all of them. That's how I've read the last 3, so I can't really show much of them considering a lot of them were ebook format, or I'm going to loan out from the library in ebook or audiobook format. Next, going back to more traditional high fantasy, we have Malazan Book of the Fallen by Steven Erikson. This is a series that is notoriously daunting, but you know what? I like a challenge, and I think I'm going to save these for after the Wheel of Time, you know, take one giant fantasy series at a time, but I'm super excited to get into these eventually. And as a plus, the author is Canadian. As far as I know, each book in the series follows a different story within the same world that are loosely connected or have a grand overarching story across the whole thing, but that's it. I don't really know much more about it. So I've collected 3 of these so far, the first one, the second one, and I think the 4th one, but my library has all of them. So if I can't find these at used bookstores, I'm not gonna worry too much because I'll know that I have the ebook versions available to me. Next, we have the Earthsea Cycle by Ursula K. Le Guin. This is a series that is super famous and classic and everybody loves it. I haven't read any of these or collected any of them. I know that the big box retail store near me has a set, I think it's like $70 or something, of all of the Earthsea books in one. I'm saving up to buy that and maybe just read them through in one go rather than collect each individual book. I don't know much about the series besides its classic status, so I'm trying to go in as blind as I can and just enjoy the ride. I know they're really good. Next, we have the novels of Gavriel Kay, another Canadian author. So this isn't just one series, this is an author actually that I've been interested in reading for a long time. His name came up for me when I started getting back into fantasy, and I actually discovered when I was reading the Silmarillion that he helped put that together with Christopher Tolkien. And speaking of Tolkien and the Silmarillion, it reminds me that I really have to finish Unfinished Tales. So I did some more research on him and I discovered that he had some highly regarded novels, of which I have The Lions of Alrasan, Tigana, and Isabel, and I'm also really interested in reading his trilogy, The Fionavar Tapestry. I've heard his works are very emotional and have great character stuff, so I'm excited to get into those. I think I'm gonna save them for next summer, unless the Wheel of Time is consuming my entire life still at that point. All right, next we have The Kingkiller Chronicles by Patrick Rothfuss. So this is one that I'm not entirely committed to reading. I told myself I'm only gonna read these if he finishes the series, which I know is a sensitive topic for a lot of people. I've heard they're great. I heard the writing and the prose is beautiful in these and totally worth reading. And if I'm gonna read these first 2 books, I need to know that the 3rd one is done. I don't wanna start the first 2 and just be left with an incomplete series, no matter how good the first 2 books are. So I'm not gonna get emotionally invested in them like so many people have, which may lead to some disappointment and frustration if the 3rd book doesn't get finished. So this leads into the next series actually, which is A Song of Ice and Fire by George R.R. Martin, specifically books 4 and 5. I've read the first 3. I started getting into the series when the show was very popular in the middle of its run. I had seen the first season already, but the book to me was perfect. It had a murder mystery kind of vibe to kick it off, and it developed into this fantasy world which felt so real and brutal and harsh, and I was super into it, and I read books 2 and 3. 3 I really liked as well, that was crazy. But by the time I finished book 3, we had been several years into that wait between books 5 and 6, which as of almost October 2021 we're still in, and I just didn't want to continue books 4 and 5 if, you know, George R.R. Martin wasn't going to finish the series. I heard the quality dips a little bit in books 4 and 5, more so in book 4, but like I said with the Kingkiller Chronicles, I just really didn't want to get into something if it wasn't going to be done. This point has been beaten to death on the internet though, so I'm not going to get too into it, but I just really don't want to continue the series unless 6 and 7 come out. I really want to see where George takes this in the last couple books, so if it's ever done, I'll be there reading it. Next, we have the Farseer trilogy by Robin Hobb. This is another series that sounds like it has a lot of what I'm into when it comes to fantasy. I heard that the prose in these books are really well done and that Robin Hobb is an excellent writer. And I've actually collected all 3 books in used format. I found them over a couple of runs to used bookstores and thrift shops. And I'm happy I found the covers that I did because they're slightly better than the modern paperback cover, which to me just doesn't work for me. Next, we have the Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn trilogy, or quadrilogy if you consider it that, by Tad Williams. I don't really know what these books are about. I've heard they're great though. They're complete, and that's good enough for me. I'm only kidding, but this has come really highly recommended from BookTube, and I actually collected all of these again through separate instances at used bookstores, but I managed to find all of them. The first one's in hardcover and the rest are in paperback, which annoys me a little bit, but I think I'll be able to deal with it for my initial read. This was one case where I actually saw the first book, The Dragonbone Chair, at a used bookshop like a year ago, and I thought to myself, oh, I don't need this right now. I'm not going to read this for a little while, so I won't buy it. And then of course I find books 2, 3, and 4 at a separate store, so now I have 2, 3, and 4. but no first book. So I was kicking myself for months for not buying that first book in the series. And then many months later, after a lot of searching and waiting, I finally found that hardcover version of the Dragonbone chair, and my series is complete. Next, we have Discworld. This is a big one. I don't know if I'm gonna end up actually reading every book in Discworld. I know that there's 40 some odd books, but that they're broken down into smaller series. So I've collected a couple books within a couple of those series. I think I have a couple from the Rincewind series, a couple from the Witches, and then one from the Death or Mort series. These are ones that are hard to find at used bookstores actually, because they're super popular. A lot of people pick them up, but I'm always keeping an eye out for them. And I think that once I find one complete series, that I'll start reading them then. But until then, I think I'm just gonna be patient and keep waiting. I have so many other fantasy books and big series like Wheel of Time, Malazan that I can get into first. So I think I'll put this one on the back burner and save it for a day when I have more on hand. But these are classics, right? These are Discworld. I've never heard a bad thing about them. I know I'm not gonna be disappointed by them, so I'm okay to kind of just let them sit for a while I read some other stuff. Next, we have the First Law trilogy and its subsequent books by Joe Abercrombie. This is a series that came super highly recommended to me by my cousin, who's actually another obsessive fantasy reader, and he gave it the highest recommendation he could for me to read it. I heard they're very dark and very violent, which is nothing I'm opposed to. As I said, I read A Song of Ice and Fire, so I kind of know what I'm getting into. I haven't found these used because they're relatively new books, but I did find that the retail store nearby is actually selling the first trilogy box set for about like 35 bucks. So I think I'll pick those up when I'm ready to make the move to read them. And lastly, we have Mistborn Era 2. Mistborn Era 1 was actually the series of books that got me back into reading fantasy over the last couple of years. I'm about to make a video about this actually, so I won't get too deep into it, but I had taken a break from fantasy for a number of years besides reading Lord of the Rings and rereading Harry Potter in my young adulthood. But as an adult, I wasn't really a fantasy reader, and it wasn't until I came across Mistborn that I actually got back into fantasy, and the reason why I'm reading all these series that I've listed so far. It was a great complete series that I really liked, and they weren't too big or too long. The size was just perfect for me for what I needed to get back into fantasy. And it was my first instance with kind of the modern hard magic trend, which I really liked. It was kind of refreshing to me. The only hard magic system I've really encountered in fiction being Avatar: The Last Airbender. So coming from Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings, it was nice and a little refreshing to get into what modern fantasy was doing, and in a way that was done really well. Brandon Sanderson is a great author. So in finishing that trilogy, which I finished last year, I really wanted to get into more fantasy, modern fantasy, but I knew I needed a break from that world for a little bit because it was such a huge thing for me. So I'm taking a break for a little while until I get to Era 2. And I've heard that the first couple books are a little different. They're shorter, more contained than maybe the first Mistborn series, but I'm super excited to get into it. And I know I'll want to read the further eras as they come out. So reading this will be absolutely necessary for me as a fan of the series. So that's it for my fantasy TBR. I know at this point you may be asking, Stormlight? Where is Stormlight? Why hasn't he mentioned Stormlight? Surely there's a mistake here. He must have just forgotten to mention it. I will read these someday. Maybe. So these were on my TBR for a while, but in reading more fantasy, I've come to realize how massive these books actually are and that there's going to be 10 of them. And I don't really want to get started on them for a little bit. I really want to read stuff like Wheel of Time, Malazan first before I get into these. So I put them on the way back burner for a while. Also, my brother, who's a Stormlight fan, kept really annoying me about reading them. He would always get on me about starting The Way of Kings all the time. So to annoy him, I told him that I wouldn't read those books until I got to 10,000 subscribers, which may or may not happen. If it does, great. If it doesn't, oh well. But I guarantee you, if the day ever comes that I hit 10,000 subscribers, I will film myself going to the store, I will buy The Way of Kings, and I will start it that day. So that's it for the fantasy series that I want to read. There's more I could talk about, but I don't want this video to run too long. So instead of talking about the rest of those fantasy books and letting this video go on forever, I'll show you. Alright, so that's it for fantasy. Now let's get into sci-fi. So let's start with another big series that is super hot and talked about right now, which is Dune. I actually read Dune, specifically the first book in the series, not the entire thing, about 4 years ago, and I loved it. I was really into it, and I was actually in Morocco when I was reading it, which is a really cool experience, being among the sand there and the ocean and reading that story. And I had heard that there were a bunch of sequels. I wasn't too sure if the quality held among the rest of them compared to the first one, but I was interested in reading them nonetheless. But last summer, I actually found a nice copy of Dune Messiah, which is the second book in the series, at a used bookstore. I was actually thinking about continuing with the series or maybe rereading Dune and then going through the sequels when the movie came out, but life has gotten in the way this year and it just didn't work out that way. But I think once I find the other books in the series at used bookstores, then I'll read the entire thing. But as of right now, I only have the first two, so it's gonna be a little while. Next, we have the Robots, or Elijah Bailey series or something like that, by Isaac Asimov. These are mystery detective novels that are follow-ups to I, Robot. They take place in the same world. And I, Robot was a book that I wasn't really expecting to love as much as I did. I had read Foundation a few years ago, the first book in that series, and I liked it. It was pretty good, but it wasn't necessarily, something that blew my mind. But I, Robot did that for me. And to find out that there was a follow-up series that were mystery detective novels was pretty cool. So far, I've collected 3 of them. I know there's 4, the one that I don't have being Robots and Empire, but I've managed to find the first 3 in used stores. Something I really liked about iRobot, and I guess this is true for Foundation as well, is that I really enjoyed Asimov's writing style when it came to just how he approaches storytelling as kind of problem solving. A lot of the time, it's just his characters trying to figure out what's wrong and how to fix it. And I thought that was really engaging, and it was something new for me. So having that mix with mystery and detective fiction is going to be really interesting to see. And continuing on from Isaac Asimov, we have Foundation, specifically books 2 and 3. Like I said, a few years ago, I read Foundation 1, which I liked, but for completionist's sake, I want to finish books 2 and 3. I think they're about the same size as the first one, and they're not too long. And if it follows the trend of the first one, it'll hopefully have more of that problem-solving storytelling, which I really enjoyed. And I'm excited to kind of see how that world fleshes out a bit more and develops as the series goes along. I know there are sequels to this trilogy, but I heard they aren't as good as the original one. So maybe if I really like books 2 and 3, I want to find out where it goes from there. Then I'll add the sequel series to my TBR, but if not, I'm not going to be too worried about it. Next, we have The Expanse by James S.A. Corey. This is a series that's kind of flip-flopped on and off of my TBR. It was first on there when I was creating my sci-fi fantasy one, and then I realized that all the books were $25+ at the retail store and was too much for me, considering I think there's 8 or 9 books. And then recently I found out that the library has them, so they're back on my TBR again. I probably won't read them anytime soon, but just to know they're there is great. This is another series I don't know much about. I know when the show was first coming out, there was a lot of comparisons of it to Game of Thrones. I don't know how true that is, but nonetheless, I'm still excited to read this, and my brother actually just bought the first book in the series, so I'm waiting for him to tell me whether or not it's worth it or maybe something I would be into. And the last series I have on my sci-fi TBR is the Sprawl trilogy, specifically books 2 and 3. If you didn't know, the first book in this series is Neuromancer, a book which I really liked. I love cyberpunk as a setting, and I think there's a lot of cool ideas that are sprung from cyberpunk and the ideas that come with it. And having finished Neuromancer, I really wanted to see where the world went from there. I don't think these books are necessarily super direct sequels to it, but it'll be really nice to go back into that world because it was so fleshed out and rich. So far, I found book 3, Mona Lisa Overdrive, but I won't get into that probably until I get book 2, which is Count Zero. So that's another one that's on the back burner for me until I find book 2. And now, like I did before with the fantasy list, here are some books that I don't necessarily have the time to go into a lot of detail about, but I wanted to let you know that they're on my TBR anyway. So hopefully I'm running them on screen right now. But a lot of these are classic sci-fi, which is something I'm trying to get into a bit more. And a lot of these I actually have in my possession already, or the library has them. So that's it for my sci-fi fantasy TBR. I hope you enjoyed it. If you saw something on my list that you've read and liked, let me know about it. Or if there's something you think I'm missing on my TBR, if you have a recommendation, let me know about that too. This was actually really fun going through my TBR, so I think I might do more of these. I'm planning on doing one actually for horror that I'll release in the month of October. Before you go, remember to do all the YouTube stuff like liking and subscribing and all that. Thank you for watching. Please remember to support your local library, and I'll see you next time.